my husband's friend did this to me on the farm. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Love Clinic's 30K Stories. My name is Emma, and I'm a wife navigating through unexpected challenges. Today, I want to share a deeply personal story that at first glance might have seemed like an ordinary moment, but ultimately turned my life and marriage upside down. This story revolves around temptation, infidelity, and the difficult choices we sometimes make when our emotions overpower our rationality. Can we overcome these challenges, and can love, loyalty, and regret heal the wounds within? If you find this story intriguing and want to follow what happens next, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to share, learn, and grow together. Join me in exploring how one moment can change a whole life. It was meant to be just a simple weekend escape to the farm, a chance for us to unwind, breathe in the fresh air, and step away from the daily grind. My husband, William, and I had been married for 5 years, and I believed everything was going well. Life seemed perfect. William had a stable job, and we lived in a cozy home. While our lives weren't filled with constant excitement, we were content and satisfied with how things were. Then the phone call came. It was James, William's best friend. They had known each other since high school, and James had been a constant presence in our lives for as long as I could remember. Out of the blue, he called to invite us to spend the weekend on his farm. James wasn't just any friend. He was someone you could always count on. The kind of guy you'd call in a pinch. Reliable, grounded, and effortlessly comforting, James had a way of putting everyone at ease. His invitation seemed natural. It was James, after all, but I couldn't shake a subtle unease when he mentioned how quiet the farm was now that his wife and kids were away visiting her parents for the weekend. It felt like he was trying too hard to convince us to come, emphasizing how it would just be the 3 of us. Nothing about it was outwardly strange, yet a tiny voice in my head made me pause. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination. After all, it was just a couple of days. What could go wrong? William, however, was thrilled. It'll be fun. We haven't had time to unwind in forever. Moreover, James says he has new things on the farm to show us. It sounded harmless enough. So we packed our things and set out early, ready for what we thought would be a relaxing weekend escape. Saturday morning, the drive was serene, with the gentle hum of the car blending into the quiet countryside. The open fields and rolling hills had worked their magic when we arrived. The crisp air carried the faint scent of wildflowers, and the tranquil stillness felt like a warm embrace. It was the perfect escape. James awaited us as we pulled up, his trademark wide grin and firm handshake exuding a sense of familiarity and comfort. There was something so steady about James. He made life seem uncomplicated, even though I knew he had his share of burdens. I smiled and hugged him, trying to dismiss the vague unease that lingered in the back of my mind. As soon as we entered James's farmhouse, it was as though we had stepped into a completely different world. The house was cozy, radiating warmth and charm. Polished wooden floors creaked gently underfoot, and a grand stone fireplace dominated the living room, its presence both commanding and inviting. The rustic decor, antique furniture, vintage farm tools hung neatly on the walls, and earthy, muted tones gave the space a timeless appeal. It was enchanting, as though the house was an extension of the serene countryside. Lunch was simple yet hearty, and conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did when James was around. We laughed over shared memories, caught up on old friends, and swapped stories about life's small adventures. Nothing about the afternoon seemed unusual, yet a nagging sense of discomfort refused to fade. William was completely at ease, his laughter unguarded and genuine. He always seemed to relax around James he rarely did elsewhere, their friendship bringing out a lightness in him that was hard to replicate. Yet, as I watched him, I noticed something I hadn't before, an eagerness, perhaps even a spark of curiosity that made him gravitate toward the property. It wasn't like William to care about such things, and the subtle shift left me unsettled. "Betty." James led the way, his voice steady and reassuring as he pointed out the farm's newest features. Fields stretched endlessly under the golden light of late afternoon. A small pond shimmered in the distance, and the melodic chirping of birds filled the air. The landscape was undeniably picturesque, but the overwhelming peace of it all began to feel almost surreal, like a beautiful painting concealing something beneath its surface. Followed, determined to shake off the unease, but the farm's enchanting stillness only deepened the sense that something was amiss. We wandered in quiet contemplation for a while, with James occasionally pointing out the new animals he had brought in and sharing his vision for the property. I nodded along, trying to focus on his words, but I couldn't shake the unease that had been following me all day. When we reached the edge of the woods, he gestured toward a small bench near the trees and sat down. I stood there, gazing out at the tranquil land, trying to appear composed despite the storm of thoughts in my mind. Then James turned to look at me, and something in his eyes changed. It was no longer the familiar gaze of the dependable friend I had known for years. It was deeper, more intense, and unsettling. At that moment I didn't understand, but suddenly I realized how close we were. Too close. My breath caught, and instinctively I stepped back, my mind racing to make sense of the moment. James reached out and gently touched my arm. It wasn't aggressive, but the tension lingered long enough to make my heart race. A strange energy hung between us, and my discomfort grew. Was this a harmless gesture, or was it something more? I couldn't tell, but my gut warned me this wasn't ordinary. Before I could react, William's voice rang out from the barn, breaking the tension like a burst of fresh air. James quickly pulled his hand away, his movements almost too deliberate, and for a moment we both stood frozen in an awkward silence. "Let's head back," he said, his tone forced and overly casual. I nodded, but as we walked, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something had shifted, something I didn't yet understand, but knew I couldn't. That evening we gathered around the dinner table, the warmth of the fire dancing in the cozy farmhouse as James served his homemade stew. The atmosphere should have been light-hearted and comforting, but I couldn't escape the happiness that lingered in the air, a weight I felt but couldn't name. I tried to brush off the strange moment earlier, telling myself it was nothing, but it clung to me like a shadow. James, too, seemed different. Though he acted as the perfect host, I caught him stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Each time, my stomach tightened, my unease deepening. I smiled through it, forcing myself to laugh at the right moments and join the conversation, though my voice felt hollow. Inside, I was tense, a stark contrast to the cheerful buzz of the evening. The talk shifted to wine, and James suggested we have a glass or two to unwind. I hesitated, wanting to decline, but William was enthusiastic. "It'll be fun," he said, his grin wide. "We never get to relax like this." Reluctantly, I agreed, letting the wine fill my glass. At first, the evening grew a little lighter, the conversation flowing more easily, and laughter filled the room. But as the hours wore on, and the wine blurred the edges of my thoughts, things began to change. James became more charming, his words laced with subtle flirtation that was impossible to ignore. His eyes lingered on me longer than they should, and the tension between us grew sharper, no longer something I could dismiss. I wanted to believe it was just the alcohol playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. William, meanwhile, was oblivious, laughing and enjoying himself, the wine loosening his usual reserve. Watching him, I felt a pang of guilt, but also frustration at his lack of awareness. The contrast between his carefree demeanor and the storm brewing inside me only heightened my unease. The farmhouse, so warm and inviting earlier, now felt suffocating, its charm unable to dispel the growing tension. He was talking about some work project with James, completely oblivious to the shift in energy between James and me. I sat there, trying to focus on William's voice, but it felt distant, as if I were listening through a fog. With each passing moment, the space between James and me seemed to shrink. I could feel the heat of his presence, an invisible pull I didn't want to acknowledge. My heart raced, and my palms felt clammy. The more I tried to steady myself, the more I felt like the situation was slipping out of my control. As I gained some control over my breathing, then it happened. James's hand brushed mine. It was subtle, so casual it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. I knew it. And he knew it too. My breath hitched, my body tensed, and suddenly the room felt stifling. That fleeting touch changed everything. I started to notice him more and more, the way he leaned in just a fraction closer, the deeper tone in his voice, the unspoken intent behind his words. It wasn't overt, but it was undeniable. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, blame it on the wine or the strangeness of the evening, I couldn't. Something was happening, and I was powerless to stop it. When we moved to the living room, I hoped the change of surroundings might offer some relief. James played soft music, poured another round of drinks, and we began reminiscing about the old days. On the outside, everything seemed normal, even pleasant, but underneath, the tension hummed in the air like static. Every time I glanced covertly at James, I caught an unsettling look in his eyes. Intense, searching, and completely inappropriate. It made my skin crawl and flush, a maddening blend of discomfort and something I couldn't fully articulate. When William got up to fetch more firewood, leaving James and me alone, my pulse quickened. The room felt too quiet, the music too soft. I didn't expect it when James leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. "You know," he said, "you look beautiful tonight." My heart skipped a beat. Was he serious? Was this a joke? I forced a weak smile, scrambling for something to say. "Must be the firelight playing tricks on you," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But James didn't laugh. His gaze held mine, unrelenting, and I could feel the heat radiating off him as if his words had weight far beyond the surface. "You've always been beautiful," he continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "But you've always been with William. I respect that. I do. It's just, sometimes I wonder what it would be like if things were different." I froze. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat, and a blush crept up my neck. Was he saying what I thought he was? Was he truly crossing that line? My mind spun, overwhelmed by confusion and disbelief, but before I could start making sense of it, the sound of William returning shattered the moment. William came back into the room, his cheerful presence cutting through the charged silence like a lifeline. James immediately straightened up, his casual demeanor slipping back into place, as though nothing had happened. I forced myself to act normal, but my heart was racing, and my pulse was pounding in my ears. I avoided looking at James, afraid that my eyes might betray the confusion and guilt swirling inside me. William, oblivious to the undercurrent between James and me, sat down and started talking about a new project he was working on. His enthusiasm filled the room, but it only heightened my discomfort. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was a storm of thoughts I couldn't quiet. The memory of James's gaze and his words replayed in my head, and no matter how much I tried to push it aside, it clung to me like a second skin. By the next day, the unease hadn't faded, it had only deepened. I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened, nor forget how James's voice had lingered with meaning. I told myself over and over that it was nothing, that I must have misread the situation, but deep down I knew the truth. James had crossed a line, and it left me grappling with emotions I didn't want to face. We spent the day outside, wandering the property, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of James's eyes on me. Every time I glanced his way, his gaze was there, steady and unrelenting, and it made my stomach churn. I forced myself to focus on the day's activities, but I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, the tension building with every step. It was as if something was looming out of reach, something I couldn't control or stop, and it set me on edge. In the barn that afternoon, the air seemed heavier. William was off to the side, tinkering with the tractor, while James and I worked nearby. For a few minutes, it was just the two of us. I should have taken it as my cue to leave, but I didn't. That's when James moved closer. Too close. He stood behind me, his breath warm against the back of my neck, as he reached over to grab a tool from the shelf. My body tensed, my heart pounding in my chest. The barn, the world around us, seemed to fade into the background. I froze as his hand brushed against my arm, sending a jolt through me. For a moment, everything stopped. There was just him, just me, and a fleeting, dangerous temptation. I could have turned, closed the space between us, and let whatever this was take over. But then, reality came crashing back. What was I thinking? What was I about to do? My breath hitched, and I pulled away sharply, my mind racing. I should go check on William, I stammered, barely managing the words. My voice trembled, betraying my inner turmoil. James didn't move immediately. He stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded silently, stepping back. I turned and walked away quickly, my legs shaky and my thoughts in disarray. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something, a moment that could have unraveled everything. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. That evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the fire. The house was quiet, and William had gone to bed early, leaving James and me alone again. I didn't want to be alone with him, but there was an undeniable pull that kept me there. I felt like I had to stay. A part of me needed to know the truth. I needed to understand if what had happened in the barn was just an accident, or if it meant something more. James came into the room and sat down across from me, his eyes intense. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I felt my heart sink. I knew this conversation was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to make things weird between us, but I need to be honest with you. I can't stop thinking about what happened in the barn earlier." I looked at him, trying to keep my composure. "James, we can't. This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling slightly, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "I know it's not right," he said, "but that doesn't change how I feel. I've always respected you, and I've never wanted to do anything that would hurt you or your marriage. But when I'm around you, I can't help it. There's something about you, something I can't ignore." I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing, and for a moment I wondered if this were the moment everything would fall apart. "James, we can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not just about me. It's about William, too. I love him, and this would ruin everything." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "I don't want to ruin anything, I swear, but I need you to know that I care about you, more than just as a friend." My chest tightened and my head began to spin. What was I supposed to do now? How could I just walk away from this? How could I forget the words he had just said? That night, after James's confession, everything felt different. It was as though the world had shifted on its axis, and I was left trying to find my footing in a place that no longer felt familiar. I barely slept. My mind raced a mile a minute, replaying the conversation over and over. How had we gotten here? What was I supposed to do now? The worst part was that, despite everything, there was a part of me that understood what James was saying. I wasn't blind to it. I had felt the connection too. There was something about the way he looked at me, something about the way he made me feel that I hadn't experienced in a long time. But I had a husband. I had a life, stable and predictable, and I wasn't ready to throw that away for a fleeting moment of passion. Or maybe it wasn't just about passion. Maybe it was something deeper, something that scared me more than I was willing to admit. But as much as I wanted to tell James to leave, to walk away and never bring it up again, I couldn't. There was something in his eyes that made me feel like if I shut him down too harshly, I'd be closing the door on something I might never get back. It was stupid, I knew that, but in the heat of the moment, I couldn't see where the line was anymore. The next day, the tension was unbearable. Every time I looked at James, my stomach churned. And every time I looked at William, I felt like I was lying to him. It was a constant war within me, my loyalty to my husband and the magnetic pull I felt toward James. The confusion and guilt swirled inside me, and I didn't know how to escape it. We were outside, William and James fixing a fence while I cleaned up around the barn. I could hear their voices in the distance, laughing and joking like nothing was wrong. But I felt like I was suffocating in the space between them. The air felt dense and suffocating, its weight pressing down unbearably. I wanted to scream, wanted to tell James that this couldn't happen, that I couldn't betray William like this. But there was a nagging thought at the back of my mind, a fear that gnawed at me. Had I already betrayed William? Was I too far gone already? As the day wore on, James seemed to grow bolder. Every time he passed me, his hand brushed against mine, or he'd comment about how great I looked. I started to wonder if he was doing it on purpose, pushing me toward something, testing the waters to see how far he could go. Was he waiting for me to make the next move? Or was it all just his way of seeing how much I could take before I broke? I tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts from my mind, but it wasn't easy. It was becoming impossible to ignore, especially when we sat down to lunch. We were eating outside under the shade of a large tree, and William was talking about a new project at work, but I couldn't focus on anything he was saying. All I could think about was James sitting next to me, his leg accidentally brushing mine under the table. My heart raced, and I had to force myself to swallow the food in my mouth, trying so hard to act normal, to pretend everything was fine. But the air between us felt suffocating, thick with tension, and I couldn't breathe. Finally, James broke the silence. "You're so quiet today," he said, eyes locked on me with that same intense gaze. I forced a smile, but it felt strained, like a mask over the chaos inside me. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice wavering as I tried to cover up the storm brewing in my chest. I couldn't look at him anymore. I couldn't bear it. But I also couldn't move away from him, couldn't escape the pull he had on me. It was like I was stuck, trapped in this moment, not knowing how to get out. William looked at me then, his brow furrowing slightly. "You okay?" His voice was full of concern. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile, trying to sound normal. Just tired, I guess." James's eyes flicked between William and me, and then he gave me a small, knowing smile. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking, but at that moment, I felt exposed. I felt like everything was about to unravel, like I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. That evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted mentally and emotionally drained from the tension, from trying to act normal when everything inside me was screaming to run, to escape, to get away from James and his unspoken intentions. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would clear my head, hoping that the night would somehow give me the distance I needed to think. But of course it didn't. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day over and over in my mind. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke up with a start, my heart pounding at the sound of a soft knock on the door. Who could be knocking at this hour? I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. Before I could even move, the door opened slowly, and there stood James, looking down at me with a mixture of hesitation and determination. My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I can't stop thinking about you." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Was this happening? Was James standing there in my room, saying these things? "I know it's wrong," he continued, taking a step closer. "But I need to know if you feel the same way, because if you do, I can't just pretend like nothing's going on between us." I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to order him to leave, to run and protect what I had with William. But another terrifying part was tempted to just let go, to see where this feeling between James and me could take us. Before I could say anything, James stepped closer, reaching to touch my face. His fingers brushed against my cheek, and my breath hitched. I couldn't move. He was so close now, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. All I could think about was how much I wanted to kiss him, how much I wanted to see where this would lead. But then I heard a noise, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the room. James quickly stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. I jumped to my feet, my mind racing. This wasn't happening. This couldn't happen. I rushed to the door and pulled it open as William rounded the corner. He looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking at me and James, who was now standing awkwardly by the bed. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. This moment had just changed everything. The next few moments felt like they lasted a lifetime, the silence between us thick with unspoken words and questions I wasn't sure I could answer. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at William, my heart pounding. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and panic. What had just happened? What was I supposed to do now? The room felt suffocating, the silence overwhelming. William looked at me, then at James, and for a brief moment, the tension in the air was so thick it felt like I couldn't breathe. I could see the questions in his eyes, the suspicion creeping in. But he didn't say anything. He just nodded slowly, as if he was giving me a chance to explain myself, but also waiting for me to do something that might prove he was right to trust me. "William, I began, but my voice caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? How could I explain that I had let myself be swept away in a moment of weakness, that I had let James get so close? The words felt trapped inside me, suffocating me from the inside out. But William didn't give me the chance to finish. "It's fine," he said softly, his voice calm but distant, like he was already distancing himself from whatever was happening. I'm just going to get some water. I'll be right back." With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall. A wave of relief washed over me, but an even stronger feeling of dread quickly replaced it. What had just happened? Why had James come in here in the first place? And why hadn't I stopped him? Every instinct in me screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't undo it, couldn't take back what had just occurred. I turned to face James, my legs trembling as I tried to steady myself. His eyes were wide, his expression unreadable, and in that moment, I realized how much I had allowed myself to be pulled into something I wasn't prepared for. "You should go," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. This isn't right. You can't be here." James nodded slowly, his face a mixture of regret and frustration. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with something I couldn't place. "I shouldn't have done that. I needed to know if there was something between us. I thought maybe you felt it too." "I don't know what I feel," I replied, shaking my head as if to shake off the emotions threatening to consume me. "But I know I can't do this. I can't hurt William. I can't hurt our marriage. It's not worth it." "It never was." James didn't say anything else. He just looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, a tangled mess of emotions, feeling more lost and terrified than ever. I closed the door behind him and sank onto the bed, my head buried in my hands. I couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment, I was questioning everything, and the next, I was left drowning in guilt and confusion. How could I have let this happen? Why had I allowed myself to get so close to crossing that line? My chest tightened with panic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping out of control, just beyond my reach. William's footsteps returned, coming down the hall toward my door. My heart lurched. I quickly wiped my eyes, hoping he hadn't noticed how shaken I was. But deep down, I knew I couldn't hide this. I couldn't lie to him. Not now, not after everything that had happened. William knocked softly before pushing the door open, his eyes soft but guarded, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me to explain. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, standing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I guess I felt like I needed to check on you." I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and met his gaze. My heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of guilt, and every breath I took felt like a struggle. I knew that if I didn't tell him the truth now, it would only get worse and fester, and the lies would tear us apart completely. "William, I need to talk to you," I said, trembling. "There's something I need to tell you, something that happened with James," he said. His face softened as he stepped closer, concern in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice gentle, but with an undercurrent of unease. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, but it felt impossible. I had never felt so small, so afraid. "I don't know how to say this, but I almost crossed a line with James tonight. He came into my room and I didn't stop him. I didn't tell him to leave. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." William's face drained of color as I spoke, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal beginning to form. But he didn't shout. He didn't explode. He stood there, silent for a long moment, his face unreadable, as though he was struggling to process what I had just said. "You almost crossed a line," he repeated quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe it. "What does that mean exactly? You mean you were about to—" I shook my head, the tears threatening to spill over. "No, William, nothing happened, nothing physical. But he came in, and he said things that made me question everything, and I let him get too close. I let it go too far." William didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his gaze distant, like he was trying to shut himself off from the words I had just thrown at him. The silence between us stretched on, thick with things unsaid, with words I couldn't take back. Finally, his voice broke the silence, calm but sharp. "I can't believe this," he whispered, almost to himself. I trusted you. I trusted you both. And you let him in like that. I'm sorry, I choked out again, my voice cracking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I love you, William. Please believe me. But even as I spoke those words, I could see the doubt in his eyes, and the trust, once so solid, was slipping away, slowly but surely. I could feel it leaving me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The damage had been done, and no matter how much I apologized, it wouldn't be enough. It would never be enough. William turned his back to me, heading toward the door. He didn't look back, but his voice carried over his shoulder, low and cold. I don't know if I can look at you the same way after this. I need some time. We both do. And with that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed felt suffocating, heavier than I had ever felt, and I was left standing there, broken, drowning in the guilt of what I had almost allowed to happen. I stood there alone, frozen in the silence, feeling as though the weight of the world was crashing down on me. My chest tightened with an unbearable pressure, each breath a struggle. I had lost everything. My marriage, my sense of security, my peace of mind, and it was all my fault. The guilt consumed me, wrapping around me like a vice, suffocating every ounce of clarity. I couldn't escape the overwhelming shame that gripped me, the knowledge that I had caused all this, and now there was no way back.